king of German mercenaries.
Chapter 284, Decisive Victory, Part 1. Looking at the slowly advancing Saxon infantry, Marin patted his head. I seem to have forgotten something. Oh, it's the warships. Marin finally remembered the warships he had ambushed on the Ems River. Because he had been keeping an eye on the movements of the Saxon army and making responses, Marin almost forgot about the 3 warships ambushed on the Ems River. So Marin quickly ordered, "Quick, light the signal fire." Then, his men, on another high platform, began to light signal fire to Captain Kidd, who was lying in ambush on the Ems River in the distance, to come and clear the Saxon pontoon bridge. Soon, smoke rose high into the sky. Captain Kidd, who had been observing the battlefield through a telescope, saw it and immediately gave a loud order, "Sailors, hoist the sails, set the oars, and enter the Leda." In order to facilitate navigation in inland rivers where winds are not too strong, the 3 warships led by Kidd this time not only have sails, but also have some oars installed on the sides to facilitate inland river maneuvers. However, in order to avoid being discovered by the Saxons, Kidd's 3 warships hid a little far away, so it would take some time for them to reach the battlefield. Seeing the enemy's infantry approaching step by step, Marin began to get a little nervous. However, those who were more nervous than Marin were the militiamen on the Saxon side who were being oppressed by the veterans and walked in front. Those militiamen were originally recruited temporarily. They joined the war to gather numbers and strengthen their momentum, and on the other hand, they were responsible for serving the knights. Because many of the 3,000 knights of the Duke of Saxony were poor wandering knights. When the knights went to war, they did not wear plate armor and horse armor at the beginning. In many cases, their plate armor, horse armor and lances were placed on the carriage. Usually, they rode bare horses and wore knight light swords. After arriving at the battlefield, the knights put on their plate armor and horse armor, and with the help of the militiamen, they climbed onto their horses. Then, the recruited militiamen had to hand over their lances to the knights. Suddenly, after a round of charge, a knight's lance was broken, and when he came back, the militiamen had to promptly deliver a new intact lance. In other words, although the Duke of Saxony brought 20,000 troops, in fact, the most powerful ones were the 5,000 plate-armored heavy cavalry and 5,000 regular infantry. The 10,000 conscripts were only slightly stronger than the civilian laborers who were purely engaged in transportation, and they probably received sporadic military training. However, don't underestimate these militiamen. These militiamen are usually strong farmers in the countryside. They are generally braver than other farmers and better at fighting. If the battle is favorable, these militiamen with some strength can also be very useful. Once their morale is up, their combat effectiveness is not much worse than that of Saxony's regular infantry. Of course, that's when the wind is in your favor. If you encounter an unfavorable situation, it's hard to say. For example, now, seeing the knights charge causing heavy casualties, the militiamen who were forced to move forward were actually very scared. However, fear was useless. If they refused to move forward, the spears of the regular infantry behind them might pierce a hole in their bodies. So, in Marin's telescope, those conscripted militiamen, with timid expressions, walked forward cautiously and slowly. Marin was amused. How unprofessional. In front of the musketeers, instead of charging with skirmishers as quickly as possible, they actually advanced slowly. Did they think they were dying too slowly? But it is not surprising. So far, there has been no large-scale use of muskets in Europe. Naturally, there are no tactics and precautions against musketeers. Therefore, it is inevitable that the Saxons unconsciously use methods to deal with cold weapon troops. When dealing with cold weapon battle formations, moving slowly can even have benefits. For example, it can bring strong psychological pressure to the enemy, causing some psychologically fragile enemy soldiers to collapse. Because, watching thousands or tens of thousands of enemy soldiers approaching slowly, the inner pressure is indeed very great. However, for the musketeers who need time to reload, they would rather the opponent run slower. This way, they can shoot a few more rounds. When the enemy reached the 50-meter aimable range, the musketeer captains of each phalanx gave orders, "Fire! Fire! Fire!" Then, the sound of gunfire continued. Ah, 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 ah. The Saxon militiamen who were at the front were shot and fell to the ground one after another, screaming miserably, which made the Saxon militiamen who had not been shot even more nervous. However, there was no point in being nervous. The next round of shooting came soon. Pa 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 pa. Another group of Saxon militiamen were shot and fell to the ground. At the same time, the 53-pound guns in front of the battle line continued to roar. Swish puff, iron ball shells hit the Saxon militia. Those militiamen facing Marin's artillery positions were very unlucky. Because they hit the muzzle of the gun. In a blink of an eye, more than 20 iron ball shells hit the target. Not only that, the shells also penetrated strongly. The worst time was when 15 Saxon militiamen lined up in a line were repeatedly pierced by a 3-pound iron ball shell, until the shell got stuck in the abdomen of the 15th man, leaving a bloody hole the size of a bull on his chest. During this process, many militiamen's heads, arms, or legs were smashed off by the brutal iron ball shells. The scene was extremely bloody and terrifying. Finally, some timid Saxon militiamen could not bear the fear and started to scream and try to run away. However, what awaited them was the sound of spears piercing flesh. It was obvious that those who ran away were killed on the spot by the regular infantry behind them. Going forward means death, and retreating also means death. In desperation, the 5,000 militiamen, not enough at this time, had to continue to advance under the hail of bullets. Oh, they're not going to collapse yet. Marin was very surprised. After a few rounds of shooting, the enemy's casualties had exceeded 1/10. Logically speaking, these conscripts should have collapsed. However, probably because of the threat posed by the 5,000 regular Saxon infantrymen supervising the battle, these conscripts continued to advance. However, Marin was not in a hurry, but continued to watch the musketeers and artillerymen inflict death and fear on each other. Then, in Marin's telescope, the long-awaited sails of 3 warships appeared. Chapter 285, Decisive Victory, Part 2. On the other side, the Blackshirt Knights were not idle. They kept wandering around the flanks of the Saxon infantry, stopping from time to time, using carbines with simple sights to aim at and shoot at the Saxon infantry mixed in behind the formation. The Saxons had no way to deal with this, because after the Blackshirt Knights ran over, they immediately stopped and aimed and shot from a distance of 20 meters. If any of the Saxon infantrymen left the battle formation to chase, they would not be able to catch up with the Blackshirt Knights. As for the plate armor knights coming to help, don't be ridiculous, the Blackshirt Knights are looking forward to it. Because they can use the kite tactics invented by Marin to deal with those knights. Soon, more than 200 people on the flank of the 500 dismounted knights were killed. The remaining foot knights all retreated to the middle part of the infantry phalanx, where the Blackshirt Knights could not reach. The Saxon militia continued to advance under the pressure of the regular infantry, but their morale had been completely lost. At this time, the faces of those desperate Saxon militia were already full of despair. Because if they advanced, they would die, and if they retreated, they would also die. Marin also saw the desperate expressions of those people through the telescope at this time, so he suddenly thought of a good idea. Then, the infantry of the first phalanx under Marin suddenly shouted in unison to the Saxon militia who were forced to advance, "Run to both sides! Run to both sides!" The Saxon militiamen were stunned at first, and then some of them really started running to both sides. Then, the Saxon regular infantry who were supervising the battle from behind were stunned. Not only were they stunned, but even the soldiers under Marin were a little stunned. What was going on? Why was the enemy so obedient? They didn't know that Marin came up with this idea after he found out that the militiamen walking in front of him looked like they had lost all hope. You know, these militiamen have no discipline. It was a dead end, but now, the other side suddenly reminded them to run to both sides, which reminded them all at once, yes, going forward means death, and going backward also means death, but running to both sides does not mean death. Then, things got out of control. In order to survive, the Saxon militiamen who were used as cannon fodder all ran towards the 2 guns. The musketeers under Marin were also asked to stop shooting. In particular, they were ordered not to shoot the tattered militiamen, but to kill the regular infantrymen who were dressed in bright clothes and had the best weapons. Then, a farce happened. In the stunned eyes of the Saxon regular infantry, the Saxon militiamen threw away the earth bags and wooden boards they were carrying and ran to both sides easily. They could not be stopped. Although they killed some of the fleeing militiamen, they were helpless to stop the mentally collapsed Saxon militiamen who fled collectively. Ha ha ha, I didn't expect those Saxon conscripts to be so obedient. Kohler laughed when he saw this situation. That's why I don't take conscripts to the battlefield, they're not very reliable. Marin shook his head. Those conscripts are just for defending the city, so it's too difficult to get them to muster up the courage to fight head-on. When the Saxon militia ran away, 5,000 Saxon regular infantry were exposed to the guns of Marin's army. Then, this time, the ones who died under the gun were the regular Saxon infantry. In fact, whether it was regular infantry or militia, facing bullets, they would all die. However, the Saxon regular infantry was not so easily defeated. Seeing the conscripts who served as cannon fodder running away, the Saxon infantry commander shouted, "Pick up those dirt bags and keep moving." At this time, they were only a dozen meters away from the trench in front of Marin's army. Then, the Saxon regular infantry in the front row picked up the bags and continued forward. Marin's musketeers quickly stepped up their shooting, and many Saxon infantrymen who had picked up bags of dirt kept falling down. But these regular infantrymen were well disciplined after all, so after they fell down, some continued to pick up the bags and move forward. The regular infantry advanced much faster than the death-fearing conscripts. After 3 rounds of musket fire and 500 to 600 casualties, the Saxon regular infantry finally broke through to the 2 trenches and began throwing bags of earth and wooden boards into the trenches. The first ditch was quickly filled, and then the men moved on. However, by the time they crossed the first ditch, the musketeers had already loaded their guns. At such a close distance, they were basically shooting at the chest, and even though the musket bullets were prone to flying around, there would be no mistakes. So, after another round of 3-stage attack, thousands of Saxon infantry were shot down almost face to face. However, the enemy's casualties were also valuable. Many bags of soil and wooden boards were thrown into the second trench. At this time, the 200 or so surviving foot knights jumped out one after another, rushed to the wooden stakes behind the 2 ditches, and began to slash with their swords. Marin saw that this was too much, so he immediately ordered to take special care of these bastards. At this point, the 2 sides were almost face to face. Marin immediately ordered the musketeers to push down, and the spearmen and musketeers passed by sideways and pushed to the front. However, when they used their spears to poke at the Saxon foot knights who were chopping at the wooden stakes with their 2-handed swords, they found that they could not poke them. But it doesn't matter, because the musketeers had dropped many long-handled war hammers in front of the battle. Therefore, the musketeers who were close to the Saxon knights who were chopping the slanting wooden stakes simply threw away their spears, picked up their long-handled war hammers, and began to smash the plate-armored knights who were chopping the slanting wooden stakes. In the end, although some of the wooden stakes were indeed chopped down, the knights on foot were also beaten back by the long-handled warhammers. In fact, many knights in plate armor who were only concerned about the wooden stakes were directly killed or knocked unconscious in front of the battle formation. Then, across the wooden stakes, the regular infantry of both sides began a bloody battle of stabbing each other with their spears. The 2 sides seemed evenly matched. The advantage of the Saxon regular infantry was their experience, while the spearmen under Marin had the advantage because the first 3 rows of soldiers wore breastplates and iron helmets with masks, which provided higher protection. Moreover, Marin's spearmen were arranged more densely, and had better discipline and coordination. Therefore, although the Saxon infantry had more experience, the 2 sides had fought evenly for a long time. However, the difference in equipment resulted in unequal casualties on both sides. Because the 2 sides were stabbing each other through the oblique wooden spikes, the Saxon spearmen could only stab the upper body of the Marin infantry, while the lower body of the Marin infantry was blocked by the oblique wooden spikes. However, the first 3 rows of infantry under Marin had good protection on their upper bodies except for the neck and arms. Therefore, they had an advantage when stabbing each other. Marin's spearmen were stabbed, and at most they were slightly injured. The Saxon infantry who were not wearing plate armor were stabbed, and the injuries were generally serious, and many of them were stabbed in fatal places. It wasn't long before the Saxon infantry were stabbed back. However, the Saxon infantry did not retreat, but stood outside the stabbing range of Marin's spearmen, occasionally taking 2 steps forward, suddenly stabbing with their spears, and then retreating. Marin's spearmen, restricted by the inclined wooden stakes, could not move forward, and could only wait for the enemy to come up. Then, the 2 sides were deadlocked a few steps apart. Moreover, Marin did not dare to replace the musketeers. Because the Saxon regular infantry on the opposite side was also very cunning. If the spearmen retreated and replaced by musketeers, these Saxon infantry would definitely take 2 steps forward and stab with their spears. In front of the spearmen, the musketeers had no resistance. Once they were approached, they could only be stabbed. Chapter 286, Decisive Victory, Part 2. At this time, the 3 warships led by Captain Kidd also arrived at the battlefield, and they rammed several Saxon pontoon bridges and began to set fire to the wooden boats on the Leda River. The Duke of Saxony was shocked when he learned about it, but he had no way to deal with it. Because his soldiers could not defeat the East Frisian sailors on the ship, they could only watch Captain Kidd and his men wreak havoc on the river. Even worse was to come. After completely destroying the Saxon pontoon bridge and ferry, Captain Kidd began to order artillery fire on the Saxon battle formation from the rear. You know, there are several 12-pound heavy guns on the warship, and their range can reach 1,500 meters. Sure enough, soon, the cannons on the ship began to show their power. In addition to the few 12-pound cannons on board, there were also many old breech-loading bronze cannons. There was no other way, as these 3 ships were small and installing a few 12-pound cannons was already the limit. For the others, they could only continue to use the old-fashioned Frankfurt cannon with less power. After the bombardment began, the Saxon army's formation was in chaos, and the morale of the Saxon army plummeted. You know, the feeling of being attacked from both sides is very bad. Moreover, those soldiers at the end are basically conscripts, and they are very easy to collapse. Fortunately, the Duke of Saxony sent out knights to suppress the rebellion in time, so that the last 5,000 conscripts did not collapse. However, a cannonball happened to break the balance of the battlefield. Because the recoil caused the ship to shake when firing, the hit rate of the ship's artillery is very low. However, some luck factors cannot be ruled out. For example, this time, a 12-pound shell happened to fly over the heads of the Saxon army and hit the wooden platform where the Duke of Saxony was standing in the middle of the crowd. Of course, the Duke of Saxony was not killed. However, he was almost frightened to death. Because the platform collapsed, the Duke of Saxony, supported by Donitz, fled in panic and walked forward. However, because the platform collapsed, the flag of the Wettin family that the Duke of Saxony had planted on the platform as the marshal's flag also fell down. Coincidentally, Marin saw this scene through a telescope. It's not that he didn't see that the Duke of Saxony survived, but he felt that he should do something. So, he thought of Zhu Su in the Battle of Feixiu. Then, he decisively picked up the earthen trumpet and shouted, "The Duke of Saxony was killed by a cannon." The Saxon flag was smashed. The soldiers in the first phalanx under Marin were all his confidants, and they were used to following Marin's slogans. So, reflexively, the soldiers in the first phalanx followed and shouted in unison, "The Duke of Saxony was killed by a cannon." The Saxon flag was smashed. The Duke of Saxony was killed by a cannon. The Saxon flag was smashed. The Saxon soldiers who were confronting the Marin army were shocked and turned around to look. The tall Saxon soldiers were horrified to see that the high platform where their duke had stood had collapsed, and the flag was no longer visible. Then the Saxon confidence collapsed. Duke Albrecht of Saxony also heard the shouts of Marin's first phalanx. His face changed drastically, knowing the power of the other party's words. So, he began to shout at the top of his lungs, "I'm still alive, the Duke is still alive." However, this was useless. The soldiers around him naturally knew the truth. However, the Saxon soldiers far away at the front were terrified and really thought that the Duke of Saxony was killed by the cannon. Moreover, there was no second wooden platform for the Duke of Saxony to climb up. Because this time when they crossed the river, they only brought a wooden platform for observing the battle situation. As a result, many of the Saxon regular infantrymen who were originally fighting with Marin's soldiers turned around and ran away. In their opinion, the Duke has died in battle, so what's the point of fighting this war? Then, the Saxons collapsed. Standing on the high platform, Marin also saw that the Saxon army did not seem to collapse. However, that was not a problem. Marin quickly ordered, the spearmen cross the trenches and charge forward, chasing the enemy. Musketeers, run to the sides, keep up, and cover the spearmen with fire from the flanks. At this time, the 2 trenches were filled by the Saxon infantry, saving Marin the trouble. Moreover, jumping from behind the inclined wooden stakes to the front is much easier than jumping from the front to the back. One is reverse, and the other is forward. However, it is difficult to climb back after jumping out, so Marin's infantry did not dare to jump out casually before. But now they have the upper hand, so jumping out is not a big deal. Then, the spearmen under Marin climbed over the inclined wooden stakes, crossed the 2 trenches, and began to chase the collapsed Saxon infantry. Under the pursuit of the entire Marin army, the panicked Saxon infantry began to attack the main camp. Originally, the reason why Marin was in a hurry to order the charge was to drive away the collapsed Saxon front troops and attack their main camp. You know, the Saxons still have a lot of knights as their main fighting force. If they just charge with infantry, it will easily attract the enemy knights to charge. However, if several thousand enemy troops fled back on their own, that would be a different story. The enemy knights would be confused and not know what to do. The Duke of Saxony had regained control of the situation at the rear. When he saw his front troops fleeing back, he was shocked. As a veteran, he was well aware of the dangers of a fleeing soldier's attack. So he stood on the platform and shouted, "I'm still alive, I'm still alive. Go back and stop the enemy." However, it was too late. Although many Saxon infantrymen turned around and tried to resist, others were still fleeing, breaking up their temporary positions. As a result, these people were dragged by others and continued to rush towards the main camp. At this time, the Blackshirt Knights attacked again, constantly driving away those Saxon infantrymen who wanted to run to the side and prevent those fleeing soldiers from running to the side and bypassing the main formation. With the cover of several thousand Saxon infantrymen in front, Marin's spearmen approached the Saxon army and started hand-to-hand combat with those Saxon knights. However, the East Frisian spearmen, who had received instructions in advance, did not stab the knight himself, but squatted down and used their spears to stab the belly of the knight's horse. The warhorse has no armor on its belly, so it can hit anyone with a stab. Then, the Saxon knights fell down one after another and became infantry. However, the knights who fell off their horses were also very difficult to deal with, because they had high armor and could not be killed by spears. But this did not pose a problem for the East Frisian soldiers. A group of warriors with long-handled war hammers appeared. The spearmen first clamped the knights' weapons with many spears, and then the warriors holding hammers entered through the gaps and smashed their heads with the hammers. After a chaotic battle, the resistance organized by the Saxon knights was suppressed by the high-spirited East Frisian army. In desperation, the Duke of Saxony knew that the situation was hopeless and had to start fleeing. However, the floating bridge on the Leda River behind had been destroyed, and many ships were burned. In desperation, the Duke of Saxony fled eastward with a group of his most loyal knights. As for the 5,000 Saxon conscripts at the back, when they saw that the knights could no longer hold on, they immediately collapsed. Many of them simply surrendered, and some fled eastward. Marin was not in a hurry. He first sent people to watch over the surrendered people, and then led the army to chase eastward. Because he knew that there was a newly dug wider river in the east, which could block the pace of those heavily armored knights. So, after leaving 2,000 men to guard the prisoners, Marin led the rest of the army, under the cover of the Blackshirt Knights, and pursued eastward without haste. However, Marin underestimated the wisdom of the Saxons. The 3-kilometer-long and 5-meter-wide river he dug did trap several Saxon knights who were exploring the way and could not get out. However, the Duke of Saxony was also a decisive and experienced man. When he saw that Marin's army was about to catch up, he immediately ordered, "Take off all the horse armor and spread it on the riverbed." The accompanying Saxon knights were stunned, but they still carried out the order. The river was not deep, only about 1.5 meters deep. If the mud at the bottom of the river was not too soft, it would be easy for horses and people to get stuck in it. When the riverbed was covered with metal horse armor, the horses and people were no longer stuck in the mud. Then, the Duke of Saxony, along with his knights, waded across the river and fled. When Marin led his men and horses to surround them, the Duke of Saxony and his hundreds of knights had already run away. In order to make it easier to escape, the resolute Duke of Saxony even ordered the knights to take off their plate armor, and each of them only carried a knight's light sword so that they could escape lightly. Marin sighed. He didn't expect the Duke of Saxony to be so decisive that he would even abandon important horse armor and plate armor. This was very rare in the generally poor Middle Ages. You know, many poor nobles would sometimes bet with others for a set of plate armor. However, Marin also underestimated the Duke of Saxony. This old man was cunning and treacherous. Moreover, he was also very rich among the nobles. These horse armor and plate armor were valuable, but they were not in the eyes of the Duke of Saxony. If he was caught by Marin, it would be bad luck. When someone falls into someone else's hands, why don't you just ask for a high price? You know, King Richard I of England was captured by the Holy Roman Empire on his way back home. Then, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI not only forced him to kneel down and pledge allegiance, but also extorted a huge ransom of 150,000 marks. You have to know that it was 1194, and the gold and silver coins at that time were still worth a lot of money. Unlike the current coins, which are heavily adulterated. Richard I's ransom of 150,000 marks was equivalent to 100,000 British pounds of pure silver. If he was captured by Marin, the Duke of Saxony bet that his ransom would be very high. Maybe Marin would even ask for the cession of West Frisia. After weighing the pros and cons, the Duke of Saxony felt that he had to escape, so as not to be blackmailed by Marin. Marin, after the Duke of Saxony escaped lightly, did not chase him, but turned around to clean up the Saxony knights who were still fleeing. Because after the Duke of Saxony and his knights went into battle lightly, Marin's Blackshirt knights would have no advantage in mobility, and they would not be able to catch up even if they chased. At this time, these fleeing Saxon knights were running around the battlefield like headless flies, but they could not escape. Because the boats crossing the river were destroyed, there was Marin's army in the east, the Ems River in the west, and the city of Leer in the north. After half a day of cleaning, nearly 2,000 Saxon knights surrendered to Marin on the battlefield. However, what made Marin depressed was that many Saxon knights decisively took off their plate armor and abandoned their horses in order to avoid being captured. They ignored the cold river water and relied on their strong bodies to swim across the river and run away. This time, Marin did not send people to hammer the surrendered knights. After all, he still had to live in the noble world in the future. Killing the enemy knights in battle would not be a big deal even if he was condemned. But if he killed prisoners, or knight prisoners, then he would not have to live in Europe. After clearing the battlefield, Marin also discovered that 15,000 Saxon civilians on the other side of the Leda River also began to flee. Marin was also very interested in these people. 15,000 strong men, even if they were not capable of fighting, could be used as laborers. You know, Marin was planning to dig ditches to drain the water from the swamps in his territory, and he needed a lot of labor. So he ordered to rebuild the pontoon bridge and sent troops across the river to chase those civilians. However, just after Marin gave the order, he received a report that Emden was surrounded. In desperation, Marin had to send some soldiers across the river to capture the civilians, and another part to guard the prisoners. The rest followed him back to help Emden.